The morning after the long, cold night came softly. The first golden light of dawn stretched over the open fields, brushing against the fences, the barn, and the old farmhouse. The sky was painted in pale orange and pink, and the world felt quiet in a way it hadn't for days. The wind was light, the horses were calm, and the ranch, just for that moment, felt safe again. Martha Taylor stood on the porch, holding her warm cup of tea. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and watched the sun rise above the hills. The shadows that had seemed so heavy in the nights before now softened into gentle shapes. She could hear the soft clucking of the chickens, the neighing of a horse, and Eli's footsteps inside the house. It was a new day, and it felt different. For 5 long nights they had lived with quiet fear. It hadn't been loud or dangerous, but it had been real, the kind that grew inside the heart and whispered doubts into the dark. But now, standing under the soft sunlight, Martha realized something had changed. They had faced the unknown together, and the ranch still stood strong. Eli stepped out onto the porch, rubbing his sleepy eyes and letting out a small yawn. His hair was messy and his boots were only half-tied, but his eyes were brighter than they had been in days. "Morning, Ma," he said softly. "Morning," she answered, smiling a little. He stretched and looked out over the fields. The land was quiet, still carrying a bit of morning mist that floated like a thin blanket. "It feels different today," he said. Martha nodded slowly. "It does." They both knew why. The man who had been coming to their ranch at night was gone. They didn't know if he'd return, but something in the way he had walked away told Martha that he wouldn't. It wasn't just about the land anymore. It was about the way they had stood together and faced the fear that had crept into their lives. Eli leaned against the porch railing, just like he had on those quiet nights before. "I didn't think we'd get through it," he admitted softly. "Those first nights, I was scared." Martha turned to him. His voice wasn't shaky anymore. He spoke with honesty, not fear. She placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "I was scared too," she said. "But fear doesn't have to win. What matters is what we choose to do when it comes knocking." Eli looked down at his boots and then back at the fields. "I think I understand that now." The sun climbed higher, warming the porch. It touched Eli's face, showing a new kind of strength in his young eyes. He wasn't just the boy who had once run barefoot through these fields anymore. He was growing into someone who carried the weight of the land with quiet courage. After breakfast, they walked the ranch together as they always did. But this time the walk felt lighter. The fences stood strong. The ropes they had tied were still in place. Nothing had been touched. The barn smelled of fresh hay, and the horses nuzzled them gently as they passed by. Eli laughed softly when one of the horses bumped his shoulder with its nose. It was a sound Martha hadn't heard much in the last few nights. It was the sound of him feeling safe again. "You know," Eli said as they walked back toward the house, "I used to think this place was too big for us, too much for just you and me." Martha raised an eyebrow, smiling gently. "And now?" "Now I think—" He paused and looked around at the open fields, the sky, the barn that had stood against the wind for years. "Now I think we're strong enough." She didn't need to say anything. She just looked at him, her heart swelling with quiet pride. He had changed, not in a loud or sudden way, but in the quiet way that only comes from facing something hard and standing through it. Later in the afternoon, their neighbor, Mr. Harris, stopped by with his old truck. He had heard about the man who had been walking around at night. News traveled quickly in small towns. Martha told him everything honestly but calmly. Mr. Harris shook his head and said, "You did the right thing, Martha. You didn't let fear push you off your land." Martha smiled at that. She wasn't someone who liked to brag, but hearing those words made her feel steady inside. Eli helped Mr. Harris load some feed sacks into the barn while the 2 adults talked by the fence. "You've got yourself a good boy there," Mr. Harris said. "He's growing into someone strong." Martha looked at her son and nodded slowly. "Yes," she said softly. "He is." As the day turned into evening, the sky glowed golden once again. Martha and Eli sat on the porch like they always did. But this time they didn't sit with heavy hearts or waiting ears. They just sat watching the horizon. The wind brushed gently against their faces, and the lantern by the door flickered softly in the breeze. Eli leaned back on the porch steps. "Do you think Dad would be proud of us?" he asked quietly. Martha felt her throat tighten a little, but it wasn't a painful feeling. It was warm, like a memory you hold close to your heart. She looked at the fields, remembering all the nights she had stood there beside her husband. Yes, she said gently. He'd be very proud. Eli smiled softly, a little shyly. I hope so. I felt him with us some nights. Like he was watching too. Martha looked up at the stars starting to appear in the fading sky. She liked to believe that too. She liked to think her husband's spirit still walked these fields, not in a loud way, but in the quiet way the wind moved through the trees and the horses calmed when they heard it. I think he was, she said. They sat in silence for a long time, but it wasn't the uneasy silence of the past few nights. This was the kind of silence that wrapped around you like a soft blanket, a silence filled with peace. The following morning, Eli got up earlier than usual. Martha found him already outside, checking the fences. You're up early, she said, smiling. He shrugged. I want to make sure everything's good before winter gets worse. We've got work to do. There was no tiredness in his voice, no fear hiding behind his words, just steady purpose. She followed him down the path, and together they worked side by side, fixing, feeding, cleaning, and taking care of the ranch like they had always done. But this time, something was different. This time they worked with a sense of quiet confidence. The fifth night came and went with no footsteps, no swinging lantern, no shadows moving along the fence line. The sky was full of stars, the moon shone brightly, and the only sounds were the peaceful whispers of the wind. When Martha lay in bed that night, she didn't stay awake listening for trouble. She closed her eyes and let the steady quiet of the ranch lull her to sleep. It was the kind of sleep that came when your heart finally felt at rest. And Eli, in his room down the hall, stared at the photo of their family on his nightstand. It was a picture taken years ago, his father's arm around Martha, Martha's hand resting on Eli's shoulder, and the ranch sign standing proudly behind them. For a long time, that picture had made him miss what was gone, but now it reminded him of what still remained. This ranch was their home, their story, their strength. The next few weeks moved forward like any other season on the ranch. They woke early, worked hard, and faced each day with steady hands. Sometimes Eli would catch himself looking at the barn at night out of habit. But the fear wasn't there anymore. Just watchfulness. Just the kind of careful respect that came from living close to the land. One evening, as the sky turned a deep orange, Eli stood on the porch beside his mother. You know, he said softly, those 5 nights. They were hard. But I think I'll remember them for the rest of my life. Martha looked at him. I will too, she said. He nodded. Because those nights didn't break us. They made us stronger. She smiled gently. Yes, they did. They didn't need to say anything else. The wind, the stars, the soft breath of the horses, all of it spoke for them. They had faced their fear. They had held their ground. And they had learned what it truly meant to belong to a place. Eli leaned his head back and looked at the stars. I don't think I'll ever want to leave this ranch, he said quietly. It's part of who we are. Martha looked at her son, proud and steady. Then we'll keep it, she said softly, for as long as we can. The lantern glowed gently beside them, and the night settled in with no secrets hiding in the dark. The ranch was still theirs, and so was the strength they had found within themselves. 5 nights of quiet fear had become 5 nights of courage. The widow and the young ranch heir had faced the unknown, not with loud voices but with steady hearts. And in doing so, they discovered something even stronger than fear, hope. The 4th night on the Taylor Ranch felt different from the rest. The air was cold, but not just the kind of cold that came from the autumn wind. It was the kind that made the back of your neck tighten, the kind that whispered to you that something was about to happen. The sky was clear this time, with no clouds to hide the stars. A silver moon hung above the fields, shining over the fences and the barn like a quiet watchman. The soft light touched the grass, the old wooden porch, and the distant gate. Everything looked calm, but Martha Taylor had lived long enough to know better. Calm could be the quiet before a storm. She sat in her chair on the porch with a blanket over her shoulders, listening. She wasn't just waiting anymore. She was ready. Every creak of the wood, every soft rustle in the wind, every sound that came from the barn reached her ears like a message. Eli sat beside her on the porch steps. His knees were pulled close and his hands were clasped tightly together. He was tired, but he didn't complain. Over the last few nights, he had changed in small, quiet ways. His face had grown more serious. His eyes had learned to look longer at the dark. He had learned to listen to the quiet. "Ma," he said softly, not looking at her. "I can feel it. Something's going to happen tonight." Martha looked at him. She could see the same mix of fear and courage in his eyes that she had seen in her husband years ago, during hard winters and long nights. She placed her hand gently over his. "Then we'll face it," she said simply. They had spent the whole day preparing. Eli had moved the buckets closer to the barn door again. Martha had tied ropes across both the front and back gates, making small loops that would make a soft sound if anyone tried to open them. She had even placed 2 old oil lamps near the kitchen window, so the light could shine out clearly if they needed to see through the dark. Nothing they did was loud or threatening. It was quiet work, careful work. Work meant for people who loved their home and wanted to protect it without making a scene. As the night deepened, the ranch grew quieter. Even the horses were still. The soft moonlight lay across the fields like a silver blanket. Martha's heart beat slow and steady, but her mind was sharp. She could almost sense the moment when the air around them shifted. It wasn't a big change, just a gentle movement in the wind. But she noticed it. Eli noticed too. "Ma," he whispered. "I know," she whispered back. Somewhere near the barn, a soft sound broke the silence. It was small, like wood brushing against wood. Then another sound, faint but real, the creak of the gate rope being moved. Eli's hands tightened around his knees. His breath grew short. Martha placed a calm hand on his shoulder. "Breathe slow," she said gently. "Stay still. Watch." The faint light from the moon made everything look softer, but even in that gentle light they saw it. A shadow moving along the fence line. It wasn't a shape they could recognize, just a darker spot in the already dark night. Slow, quiet, steady. Eli leaned forward slightly, his heartbeat thumping in his chest. "Someone's there," he whispered. Martha nodded. "Yes." The soft sound of the bucket tipping over came next. The quiet metallic clink echoed lightly in the night. It was the same sound as before, but this time they were ready for it. The shadow moved closer to the barn. The horses stirred inside, their soft breathing turning into light, nervous shuffles. Eli and Martha didn't make a sound. They watched. The shadow moved slowly, like someone testing the space, trying to understand how close they could come without being noticed. But they were noticed. Martha slowly stood up, her blanket falling back into the chair. She didn't rush or panic. Her movements were calm, steady, quiet. She reached for the oil lamp hanging by the door and lifted it gently. The warm, soft light flickered against her face. Eli stood too, a few steps behind her. He didn't have a lamp, but he carried the quiet strength that had been growing in him over these long nights. Martha walked to the edge of the porch, lifted the lamp a little higher, and called out in a clear, steady voice. "Who's there?" The night didn't answer right away. For a moment it felt like the darkness itself held its breath. Then the shadow stopped moving. "I know you're out there," she continued, her voice calm but strong. "This is our land. This is our home. If you've got something to say, you can say it where I can see you." Eli held his breath. His mother's voice wasn't loud, but it had weight. It carried the kind of quiet power that came from years of standing firm. From behind the barn, the shadow shifted. For the first time, the moonlight caught the faint outline of a man's hat and coat. He stepped forward slowly, not in anger, not in a rush. Just quiet, careful steps. Eli's heart pounded hard, but Martha didn't step back. She stood tall on the porch with the lantern glowing softly in her hand. The man didn't speak at first. He stopped a few feet away from the barn as if unsure what to do. He looked like someone who hadn't expected to be seen so clearly. "This isn't the place to play games," Martha said gently. "You've been walking around this land for nights. What is it you want?" Finally, the man cleared his throat softly. I wanted to talk," he said. His voice was low, almost uneasy. But I didn't know how. Eli blinked in surprise. He had expected something else. "Anything else?" "But not that. Talk about what?" Martha asked. The man shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He kept his hands at his sides, not moving closer. "About the land," he said quietly. "About the ranch." Martha's heart tightened. She had feared this might be the reason. The man took a slow breath. "My brother owns the property that borders yours," he said. "He's been saying for months that this place is too much for you and your boy. He's been talking about making an offer. I came to see how things are here." Martha kept her eyes steady. "Walking around someone's home at night isn't the way to make an offer." she said calmly. The man lowered his head slightly, as if ashamed. I know, I shouldn't have done that. I didn't mean harm, I just... He paused, looking at Eli for a moment. I didn't expect anyone to stay up watching. We watch because this is our home, Martha said simply. The man nodded slowly. I understand. He took a step back, not closer. I'll talk to my brother. He shouldn't have sent me here like this. I'm sorry for the trouble I caused. Martha didn't say anything for a moment. She studied his face in the lamplight. She could see he wasn't there to frighten them. But that didn't mean she trusted him either. This ranch is not for sale, she said softly but firmly. I figured as much, he answered. I'll make sure he knows that too. The silence stretched again. Then without another word, the man turned and walked toward the fence line. The sound of his boots on the ground was soft, steady, and soon faded into the night. Eli let out the breath he'd been holding. His shoulders relaxed, though his heart was still beating fast. He's gone, he whispered. Martha lowered the lantern a little and gave a slow nod. Yes, but now we know who's been coming around. The moon shone bright over the barn again, and the horses slowly calmed. The quiet around the ranch returned, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet anymore. It wasn't filled with worry. It was steady, like a breath finally released. Eli turned to his mother. You weren't scared, he said softly, almost in awe. Oh, I was, Martha replied with a small smile. But fear doesn't get to make the choices. We do. Eli's eyes shone in the lantern light. In that moment, he understood something bigger than words. It wasn't just about the ranch. It was about standing for something you love, even when the nights are long. They went back inside together. Martha placed the lantern on the kitchen table, and Eli followed her, still quiet but no longer tense. The wind outside was soft now, brushing gently against the windows. The house didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt steady, strong. Later that night, as they sat in the living room with warm blankets, Eli asked softly, Do you think he'll come back? Martha looked toward the dark fields outside. No, she said. I don't think he will. But if he does, he'll know we're not just sitting here in the dark anymore. Eli smiled a small, tired smile. We faced it, Ma. She looked at him and felt a quiet pride warm her chest. Yes, she said gently. We did. Outside, the lantern on the barn wall was still. The ropes at the gates didn't move. The ranch, their home, stood strong under the moonlight. The long nights hadn't broken them. If anything, they had made them stronger, and though winter was still ahead, they knew they could face it together. Whatever came next, they would meet it side by side. The wind carried a different kind of chill that evening. It wasn't just the usual cold that rolled in at night. It was the kind that wrapped around the house like a quiet whisper, the kind that made even the horses uneasy. The sun had disappeared behind the hills long ago, leaving the sky painted with shades of dark blue. A thin layer of clouds floated above, hiding most of the stars. Martha Taylor stood on the porch, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders. She didn't drink tea tonight like she usually did. Her hands were free, pressed against the railing, her eyes fixed on the barn in the distance. For nights now, something or someone had been moving around their land after dark. She didn't know who and she didn't know why, but the feeling had grown stronger with each passing night. Eli came out of the house, rubbing his hands together for warmth. It's cold tonight, he said softly. His voice had a careful edge, the kind that comes when someone already knows the answer but says the words anyway. Martha nodded without looking at him. Yes, she replied. Colder than usual. Eli followed her gaze to the barn. Do you think they'll come back tonight? Martha finally turned to him. The porch light shone softly on his young face. He wasn't a little boy anymore. His shoulders had straightened. His eyes had learned how to look a little further, a little sharper. She hated that he had to grow up so fast. I don't know, she said honestly. But if they do, we'll be ready. Earlier that afternoon, they had checked every corner of the ranch again. The locks had been tightened, the fences inspected, and the lantern on the barn wall was hung high and steady. Eli had taken extra care with the gate, even placing a small metal bucket by the door. He said if someone pushed it open, they'd hear the sound. Now the land stretched out before them, wide, dark, and quiet. The wind brushed gently against the dry grass. A single owl called from a faraway tree. Eli leaned against the railing beside his mother. I keep thinking about what Dad would do, he whispered. Martha's eyes softened. He'd be standing right where you are, she said gently. He'd keep watch and make sure we're safe. And that's what we're doing too. A small, brave smile touched Eli's lips. He liked hearing that. They waited in the quiet for a long time. Minutes passed like slow drops of water falling into a still pond. Martha could hear the clock ticking inside the house. The horses shifted softly in the barn. She could even hear her own heartbeat in her ears. Then something changed. It started with a faint sound, a soft rustle like fabric brushing against wood. Martha's head lifted slightly. She didn't move fast or speak. She had learned to listen carefully. Eli noticed it too. Did you hear that? He whispered. She nodded slowly. They both turned their eyes toward the barn. At first they saw nothing but darkness. The lantern was still hanging where they left it, unmoving. But then very faintly the horses gave a low, restless sound. Eli's fingers gripped the railing. Something's there, he whispered. Martha's eyes narrowed. A soft flicker of light appeared near the gate, like the glow of a small lamp. It was faint, but it was real. Not the wind. Not their imagination. She took a quiet breath. Stay calm, she whispered to Eli. They moved back into the house slowly, careful not to make any sudden noise. Martha turned off the main porch light, letting the darkness settle around them. From the window they could see better. The moon had slipped out from behind the clouds, casting a thin silver glow over the yard. The flicker of light was moving now, slowly, almost like someone walking. The gate gave a soft creak. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make Eli's heart jump. Martha rested her hand on his shoulder. She didn't say anything, but the quiet touch told him what he needed to know. They would face this together. The next few minutes stretched longer than they should have. The light disappeared behind the barn, and all they could hear was the wind and the faint sound of hooves moving nervously inside. Eli pressed closer to the window, his breath fogging the glass. I can't see anything, he whispered. Sometimes it's not about seeing, Martha replied softly. It's about feeling what's coming. She wasn't trying to frighten him. She was speaking from years of living close to the land, where silence said more than words and where small things could mean big trouble. The sound of something bumping softly against wood broke the silence again. This time it was the bucket Eli had placed by the barn door. A soft metallic clink. Then stillness. Eli's eyes widened. They touched it, he whispered. Martha pressed a finger gently to her lips, signaling him to stay quiet. The horses inside the barn started to shuffle again. Not loud, but restless. Animals could feel things before people did. Martha had always trusted that. Then it happened. The lantern on the barn wall began to swing lightly, moving back and forth. There was no wind strong enough to make it do that. Someone had brushed past it. Martha felt a tightness in her chest, but she stood steady. Eli's breath came out quick and short, but he didn't panic. His hands curled into fists, not in anger, but in nervousness. They watched the lantern sway for what felt like a long time. Then slowly, it stopped. The light flicker disappeared into the darkness again. No footsteps followed. No more sounds came. Just quiet, Eli whispered. Why would someone come here and not do anything? Martha didn't answer right away. She was thinking the same thing. Whoever was out there didn't want to be seen. They were patient. And that made it harder to understand their reason. Finally, she whispered, I don't know. But they're testing us. Seeing if we're paying attention. Eli swallowed hard. We are, she nodded firmly. Yes, we are. That night, neither of them went back to bed. They sat near the window until the first pale light of morning touched the hills. The night had passed quietly after the lantern stopped swinging, but the feeling it left behind stayed heavy in the room. When the sun rose, Martha walked straight to the barn with Eli by her side. The ground near the gate had fresh footprints. They were clear in the damp earth, each step pointing toward the fence line. Eli crouched down, touching the dirt the way his father used to. They were here, he said softly. Martha nodded. And they didn't come to help. The barn door itself was still closed, but the metal bucket Eli had placed was lying on its side. The horses were calm again now, but their nervous breathing during the night had been real. Eli stood and looked at his mother. We can't just keep waiting like this, he said. We should do something, Martha understood. She had thought the same thought during those long, silent hours at the window. She placed a hand gently on his arm. We'll watch more carefully from now on. We'll be ready. They spent the rest of the day making quiet changes. Eli moved a few tools closer to the house so they wouldn't have to walk to the barn if anything happened again. Martha fixed the lantern so it would be harder to touch without making a sound. She even placed an extra rope across the back gate, a simple thing but one that would give them a warning. In the afternoon, a light rain came down, making the dirt soft. Martha thought it was a good thing. If someone returned that night, their tracks would be even clearer. By sunset, everything was in place. The sky turned a deep, gentle red. The ranch looked calm from the outside, just like any other quiet evening. But inside, both Martha and Eli knew the truth. This wasn't just another night. This was the night they would stop simply watching. They would start paying closer attention. They ate dinner together, neither talking much. Their silence wasn't fear. It was a kind of steady focus that both of them shared now. After dinner, they left one lamp on inside the house and sat on the porch again. The air was damp and cool. Eli leaned against the railing just like his father used to. Martha sat in the chair beside him. For a long while, nothing happened. The night was calm, the rain soft, but Martha felt something deep inside, a quiet knowing. The turning point had already come. Whether they liked it or not, their peaceful nights were behind them. Eli broke the silence with a quiet voice. "We're not alone out here, are we?" Martha looked at him. His face was still young, but it carried the weight of understanding now. "No," she said gently. "We're not. But we're strong. We'll get through this." He nodded slowly, his eyes steady. The lantern on the porch glowed softly, its light touching the edge of the yard. The wind rustled through the grass like a whisper. Somewhere in the distance, the faint call of an owl echoed again. And though the night seemed still, both Martha and Eli could feel it. The quiet tension that told them something was coming. Something real. Something that would test every bit of strength they had left. They didn't know exactly what the next few nights would bring. But as they sat side by side, facing the darkness together, they knew this. They were ready to face it, no matter what shape it came in. The ranch wasn't just land. It was their story, and they weren't going to let anyone take it away from them quietly. The wind had turned sharper over the past few days. The sun still rose bright and warm in the mornings, but the air felt colder, and the trees seemed quieter than usual. The season was changing, and so was the feeling around the ranch. Martha Taylor had lived long enough on this land to know when something didn't feel right. She could sense it now. Something was shifting, like a quiet storm slowly moving closer. It started in small ways. One morning, Martha found the barn door slightly open, even though Eli had closed it tightly the night before. A rope that hung on the wall was lying on the ground. A bucket was turned over, and one of the horses looked restless. She thought maybe the wind had blown it open, or maybe Eli had forgotten to latch it properly after feeding the horses. When she asked him at breakfast, Eli shook his head quickly. "I know I closed it, Ma. I double-checked. I even heard the lock click." She didn't want to make a big deal of it. Sometimes locks were tricky. "Maybe it was just the wind," she said softly, though she didn't quite believe it herself. Still, she smiled to ease his worried look. "We'll make sure it's shut extra tight tonight." But the feeling wouldn't leave her. That night, Martha stood at the porch after Eli went to bed. The moon was round and clear, shining over the open fields like a silver lantern. Everything looked calm, but her heart felt uneasy. She wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and kept watching the barn. The horses were quiet, their soft breaths like music in the cool night. Still, she stayed awake a little longer than usual, listening. The next day, she found something else. Near the fence line, just behind the barn, there were footprints in the dirt. Not small, not too big, just the kind that didn't belong there. She bent down slowly, touching the dry earth with her fingers. The ground was firm, so the prints were clear. She had seen enough animal tracks in her life to know these were not from a cow, a horse, or any animal she knew. These were from boots. She stood there for a long time, staring at those prints, the wind tugging gently at her hair. A quiet shiver ran through her. Someone had been walking near their barn in the middle of the night. She didn't want to scare Eli, but she also couldn't ignore it. That evening, she sat him down at the kitchen table. "Eli," she began carefully, "I need you to tell me if you saw or heard anything strange last night." He frowned and thought hard. "No, I didn't hear anything. I was really tired after fixing that fence." Martha nodded slowly. She decided not to mention the footprints yet. "Well, let's be more careful from now on," she said. Lock everything. Double-check it all. I will, he said seriously. Don't worry, Ma, I'll keep the barn safe. She smiled at his determination. He was growing up faster than she wanted. But beneath her smile, her worry grew a little deeper. The third night, the wind came in strong. It howled across the hills and made the old house creak. The trees swayed, and the horses shifted nervously in their stalls. Martha lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind. But then, beneath that sound, she heard something else. A soft clink, a wooden creak. Something outside. She sat up slowly and held her breath. The sound came again, faint but real. She quietly slipped out of bed and moved to the window. The moonlight cast a pale glow over the barn and the fields. For a moment she saw nothing, but then a lantern light flickered near the fence. Her heart thumped softly against her chest. She blinked, wondering if it was just the wind playing tricks, but the small light moved just a little. Then it disappeared. She didn't go outside. She didn't want to wake Eli either. She stood there, gripping the windowsill, breathing carefully. After a few minutes, everything was quiet again. No footsteps. No flickering light. Just the wind. The next morning, she walked straight to the fence after breakfast. Eli followed her, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. When they reached the spot, they found the old wooden gate slightly loose, as if someone had touched it. Eli's eyes widened. Ma, this wasn't like this yesterday. No, it wasn't, she said quietly. They fixed the gate together. Eli hammered the nails back in, and Martha tied the rope around it tighter than ever. She didn't say anything more, but Eli could read her face. He had seen that look before, serious and careful. He knew something was wrong. That evening, Martha and Eli finished their chores earlier than usual. They made sure everything was locked. Barn doors, windows, fences, even the chicken coop. Eli checked the locks twice just to be sure. As the sun set and painted the sky in deep red and purple, they both felt the same quiet uneasiness settle in. Ma, Eli said softly, as they sat on the porch steps together. Do you think someone's coming around here at night? Martha didn't want to lie. She looked at him and said, I don't know yet. But if they are, they'll find out we're not easy to scare. Eli nodded slowly. His hands were clasped tightly, but his jaw was firm. He wasn't a little boy anymore. He was ready to help. That night, neither of them slept easily. Martha left the lantern dim in the hallway, and Eli kept his boots by the door. The house, usually so warm and welcoming, felt like it was holding its breath. The wind was quieter than the night before, but that almost made it worse. Every small sound seemed louder. In the early hours, Martha heard the horses again. Not just shifting this time, they were nervous. She could tell by the way their hooves tapped softly in the barn. She quietly stepped out of bed and moved to the porch. The night was dark, the moon hidden behind a thin layer of clouds. She squinted toward the barn. At first she saw nothing, but then something caught her eye. The lantern on the barn wall was moving slightly. It wasn't swinging because of the wind. It was being touched. She felt her heart skip a beat. She didn't move closer. She just stood still, watching. The movement lasted only a few seconds, then stopped. A shadow seemed to fade into the darkness behind the barn. Martha's breath came out in a shaky cloud. She closed the porch door slowly and sat down on the chair inside, thinking. She knew this land. She knew its quiet nights. This was not normal. In the morning, she found a water trough near the barn tipped over, spilling what little water was left. The ground was damp and cold. Eli saw it too. His face hardened. Someone's messing with us, he said softly. Maybe, she answered. But we won't let fear run this place. They spent the rest of the day checking every corner of the ranch. Eli mended small things that didn't even need fixing, just to feel useful. Martha walked along the fence line slowly, scanning the ground for more prints. She found a few near the back gate. The tracks were light but clear enough to tell her it wasn't an animal. As the days passed, the strange happenings continued. A bucket would be moved. A fence post would be tilted slightly. The lantern would be found unhooked in the morning. It was never anything loud or destructive, just enough to keep them on edge. Enough to make the nights feel longer than they should. One evening, as Martha prepared dinner, Eli stood by the window, staring out at the fading light. I don't like it, Ma, he said softly. I don't like feeling like someone's out there. She looked up from the stove. I don't like it either, she admitted. But we can't let it break us. This is our home. Eli turned to her, his young face serious. Then we'll watch. If they're out there, we'll know. Martha nodded. We'll keep our eyes open. That night they sat together on the porch after dinner. The stars were shining bright and the air was still. They didn't talk much. They just listened. To the horses breathing, to the wind brushing against the fences, to the quiet space around them. The ranch had always been a safe place, a peaceful place. But now, it felt like a secret was hiding in the darkness. Martha took a deep breath. She had faced hard times before. She had faced storms, sickness, and loss. She would face this too. She reached over and placed her hand on Eli's. He didn't flinch. He held it back. Whatever was out there in the night, they would face it together. And as the clock ticked softly inside the house, the wind whispered through the fields, carrying with it a promise that the nights ahead would be anything but ordinary. The sun was slowly disappearing behind the wide hills, painting the evening sky in soft orange and gold colors. The wind was gentle, carrying with it the smell of dry grass and the soft sound of horses moving in their stalls. On that open land, miles away from the nearest town, stood the Taylor Ranch. It wasn't the biggest ranch in the county, but it was built with love, hard work, and years of hope. For Martha Taylor, this land was more than just fences and barns. It was the last memory of the life she once had with her husband. Martha stood on the wooden porch of the old farmhouse, holding a warm cup of tea in her hands. The steam rose into the cool air as she watched the sun sink lower. Her dark hair had strands of silver now, and her eyes, though tired, still carried a quiet strength. Her husband had passed away not long ago, leaving her with the heavy responsibility of taking care of everything on her own. The ranch, the animals, the bills, and most of all their only son, Eli. Eli was just 17, tall for his age but still carrying the softness of a boy not yet fully grown. He had his father's strong shoulders but his mother's kind eyes. He worked hard on the ranch after school, feeding the horses, fixing fences, cleaning stalls. But no matter how much he tried to act grown up, Martha could still see the child who once ran barefoot through the fields, chasing butterflies and laughing without a care. The house itself was old but full of memories. The creaking floors carried the echoes of laughter that once filled the rooms. The kitchen smelled faintly of cinnamon and fresh bread, just like the days when Martha would bake while her husband sat by the fire reading the newspaper. Now the rooms felt larger, emptier, and sometimes too quiet. The nights especially felt long. Martha placed her cup on the porch railing and folded her arms, holding herself against the evening chill. The autumn wind was changing, bringing the first whispers of winter. She had lived on this ranch long enough to know what that meant: colder nights, harder work, and more challenges. But this winter was going to be different. She could feel it in her bones. It was the first winter without her husband. The first time she would face it alone with only Eli by her side. In the distance, Eli was walking toward the barn. His boots made a soft crunching sound on the dry earth. He wore his father's old jacket, a little too big on him, but he liked how it made him feel closer to the man he missed so much. The sky was darkening now, and the first stars were starting to appear. A horse neighed softly as if saying goodnight. Martha called out, "Eli, don't forget to close the barn doors tight. The wind's getting stronger tonight." Eli waved his hand without turning around. "Got it, Ma," he said with a small smile. Martha smiled back, though he couldn't see it. She loved how he always tried to stay strong for her. She knew he missed his father deeply, even if he rarely said it out loud. Some nights she had heard him in his room, whispering to the old photo on his nightstand, the one of the three of them standing proudly in front of the ranch sign. When Eli finished with the barn, he returned to the porch. His cheeks were red from the cold and his hair was a little messy. "All done," he said, brushing his hands together. "Good job," Martha replied softly. "Come inside before it gets colder." They went into the warm kitchen together. The yellow light above the wooden table gave the room a gentle glow. Dinner was simple: bread, soup, and warm milk, but it was enough for them. They ate in quiet for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. Outside, the wind began to hum through the fields, a sound they had grown used to. "You think we can keep the ranch, Ma?" Eli asked suddenly, breaking the silence. His voice was quiet, almost careful, like he didn't want to hurt her with the question. Martha looked at him. His eyes were steady, but there was a flicker of worry in them. "We'll try," she said. "Your father built this place with everything he had. I'm not letting it go without a fight." "I can work more," Eli offered. "I don't mind." I can do the fencing, the feeding, whatever it takes." She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "You're already doing more than enough, Eli. I'm proud of you." He looked down at their hands, then gave a small nod. But in his heart, Eli felt the weight of something bigger than he had ever carried before. He wasn't just a boy anymore. He was the only man left in the house now, and that thought made the nights feel colder than they really were. After dinner, Martha washed the dishes while Eli sat by the window, staring at the dark fields outside. The moon had risen, casting a soft silver light over the land. The horses were quiet in their stalls. The trees stood still. It seemed peaceful, but Martha couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing, something she couldn't name yet. The next few weeks were going to be hard. The bank had already sent 2 letters about the ranch payments. Martha had hidden the last one in a drawer, not wanting Eli to worry, but she knew time was running out. If she couldn't find a way to pay, they could lose everything. The land, the house, the barn, the horses, all of it. She had lived through storms before, but this was a different kind of storm. When Eli finally went to bed, Martha stayed on the porch a little longer. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and looked up at the stars. Her husband had always loved the night sky. He used to say the stars were like tiny lanterns guiding them home. She closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. She wished he was still here to guide her. A soft sound broke the quiet. The horses in the barn shifted restlessly. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make Martha straighten up. She looked toward the barn, but everything seemed still again. Maybe it was just the wind. She didn't want to imagine problems that weren't there. Still, she whispered softly to herself, "We'll be all right. We have to be." The next morning came with a soft golden light. The ranch always looked most beautiful at sunrise. The hills seemed to stretch forever, and the sky opened wide like a big warm smile. Martha loved this land. It was where she had met her husband, where they had raised Eli, and where they had poured every ounce of their lives. It wasn't just a place, it was a story written with love. Eli came out rubbing his eyes, still sleepy. He carried a bucket in one hand and a piece of bread in the other. "Mornin', Ma." "Good morning," Martha said with a small smile. "We've got a long day ahead." They started their morning chores together. Eli fed the horses, brushed their coats, and checked the fences. Martha gathered eggs, milked the cow, and made breakfast. They didn't have much money, but they had enough to keep moving forward. That's what mattered. By afternoon, a neighbor drove by in his old truck and waved. People in this part of the country knew each other well. They shared news, borrowed tools, and sometimes helped each other when times were tough. Martha waved back with a polite smile, but inside she was still carrying the weight of her worries. As the sun set again, the house returned to its quiet rhythm. The crickets sang outside and the wind whispered across the fields. Martha and Eli sat together on the porch just listening. No words were needed. They both understood that this land was their home, their heart, their fight. And though the nights ahead would bring more than they expected, at that moment, they found comfort in the simple silence of the ranch. It was the calm before the storm, a storm that neither of them could yet see coming.